All right, everyone. Just wanted to do a quick kind of recap here as we're getting basically finishing the Thelin book out. Totally. Wanted to just kind of go over a couple of things as you start in to the other parts of the course, but just realize with this what we've gone through throughout the semester. We have gone through almost 400 years of higher education history, and when I try to do a bit of a recap, I'm actually including with this message a synopsis really of the eras of college growth and expansion and different things, and a good synopsis of really of what higher education in America has looked like. That'll give you a good couple page just kind of summary of what all we've worked through this entire semester. But I was kind of thinking through it, like what are some categories that we can kind of look at as we talk about it. And when I look at things, when I think of just the colonial era, and then I think of like administration and its growth and impact on higher education, legislation and litigation on higher education, and really like student life. If I could run through a couple things, and I think I will, just in those categories, just to say these are the things we've hit. And it's a lot. So when I just think of colonial, and we just kick it off with Harvard in 1636 and the impact of Harvard on colonial life and the growth and the connection from those coming from Mother England and starting their new life and their need for higher education. Then you look at that, what we call the Oxbridge model, looking at Oxford and Cambridge and what they did like and didn't like, and kind of bringing both of those forward and growing in our own model, looking specifically at departure from faculty control to more governing lay board control, things like that. The emergence of all non-colonials and their really connection in creating a legacy of the age of the being important as we got really into higher education in the 1900s. The older the college was, the more important it was to our system here in America. And then you look at in the colonial era, man, I keep saying that, sorry guys, the impact of American independence on our campuses. So you think of Ben Franklin and you think of the time of the American Revolution, and what that then began to take shape in our founding and our growth of colleges. Then you look at the impact of things like the First Great Awakening, Second Great Awakening, those types of things happening in our era of higher education. The impact of Civil War, physically on enrollments, physically on the campuses. You just think of specifically how Yale was decimated by the Civil War and its impact. So when you look at colonials right there, then you look at things like legislation and litigation. I've just got a list that I kind of made of things like 1796, you got the passage of the Public Education Act. That's a big start in formalizing education that feeds into higher education. 1819, you got the Dartmouth case. So that was a big connection between beginning to say whether or not something is public or private in higher education specifically. 1862, the first Morrill Act, so you're really creating the land-grant institutions. 1890, the second Morrill Act, so expanding that and actually creating the Historical Black College and Universities. That HBCU designation really kicks in. 1896, you got Plessy versus Ferguson, so really separate but equal, so affirming segregation, and follow up with that, you got the Kentucky Day Law in 1904. Really, unfortunately, the state of Kentucky saying segregation is legal. 1944, GI Bill comes in, and that massive impact on our college campuses of what the GI Bill did as far as expanding enrollments, expanding services, the dichotomy of soldier coming back and working with the current students on campus and that kind of feel. 1947, just after that, you got the Truman Commission. This was pushing for sweeping reform in higher education, massive reform in higher education. Unfortunately, it is 2019, and we still haven't seen some of that reform that the 1947 Truman Commission suggested. So 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education, its impact on all aspects of public education, of trying to get rid of the separate but equal common issues within segregation. 1957, a big one, Sputnik hit space, so that starts the space race, and that then spurred the National Defense Act, which really created massive funding also for federal connection into higher education for research and those types of things. Lots of our buildings on campus and many campuses got built because of Sputnik's push. You got the 1964 Civil Rights Act, so that impact of actually opening up all rights for all people. 1965 Higher Education Act. This is really your first look at federal Pell Grants and those types of things being included for opportunities for students to attend higher education. The big shift and connection of 1972 with Title IX, really looking at a lot of opportunities that have impacted higher education since then. And then all the way into like 2003, the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act. So expanding its impact and connection there. So those is just some of legislation, litigation. When you look at administration, so really what we are studying, what you're studying is higher education administration. So that growth in its shape that has grown over time since the start of Harvard and beyond. You've got originally, in the early years, only a dean of men, and you had eventually some deans of women, and then eventually that position came together, and you have deans of students, and you have other structures and layers that come online to manage other aspects of higher education, and that have now created a full career field for us, and the management of college and institutions. You look at the influence of philanthropy. You go all the way back to the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts and those types of folks, and then their shift into foundations with larger, more national and even global impacts on higher education. You look at the growth and the formalization of college sports, the issues and the positives that come with that specifically. You look at Joliet Junior College being founded in the early 1900s as the first community college. One small thing you might not even think of, but the Army Alpha and Beta tests in 1901. So these were a way for the Army in World War I to actually organize and place folks that are coming into the Army. These eventually became the groundwork for the SAT and eventually the ACT. So, and what impact has standardized testing had in higher education, good and bad. So those are the important things. 1900, you got the forming of the AAU, so you have the first beginnings of the great American university. You got Johns Hopkins in that era creating doctoral education and creating what becomes a gold standard for research and PhD education across the world. Fast forward all the way to the 70s, you got a lot of financial woes that hit, and a lot of colleges are closing at rapid paces, so you got the closing of colleges. You go all the way into more of the current times and our issues with performance-based funding and how the funding of colleges is dramatically being reshaped. And even the other impact is online education, distance education, MOOCs, the full online platform, and what that looks like for our campuses and what that could look like in the future. And then one of the other categories I talked about was student life. So you really start thinking about things like 4 Years at Yale that was published in the 1800s. And this was a deep dive into the look into the inner workings of Yale student life-wise. Before that, really, administrators didn't even concern themselves with what was going on outside of the classroom. And after that, administrators quickly realized we need to get a handle on this, let's say, and create structure to work with students. But many colleges quickly adapted a lot of this kind of playbook of what needs to happen and what opportunities for students get connected throughout campus. You've got the golden era of higher education. You got times in the 20s and 30s when America was fascinated with higher education, Time Life articles on what students wear and what they do and the activities they're involved with, all those types of things. You got a major rise in activism when you look at the end of wars, when you look at the Vietnam War, when you look at going forward into the 80s and 90s. Now really activism's kind of come back as a bigger piece that you see on campuses today. You saw really 60s and beyond the shift away from in loco parentis. Colleges are no longer the ones charged with taking care of the student. The student is an adult, and we work to grow and develop that student specifically. You got the very slow evolution over 400 years of higher education of inclusion and equity. slowly beginning and slowly growing and connecting the opportunity for women's inclusion in higher education, African American inclusion in higher education, many other races inclusion in higher education, the LGBT community included in higher education. You see a lot of those that are slowly and still evolving, because we are not perfect as a society as a whole. So I just wanted to kind of recap a couple of those things, just to kind of to talk through and really take a deep breath. Like, we've went through a lot. You've read a lot here, and you've looked at a lot. We've talked about various things and those connections. You've written through your artifact descriptions and those types of things, and just wanted to really recap some of that and just say good job in getting through somewhat of a dense textbook, but also a lot of articles and different things that also connect to what had happened over these last couple hundred years in American higher education. So with that, I just want to close off and say thanks for all your good work and reading so far.